It's 2:30 a.m. on June 17th, 1972. 5 men crouch in the dark behind desks in the Democratic National Committee offices inside the Watergate complex. Footsteps are closing in down the hallway. In 20 minutes, they'll be arrested. In 2 years, one of them will help bring down a president. And somewhere in the White House, a hidden tape recorder is already running, capturing a conversation that will end Nixon's presidency in exactly 17 words. But the real mystery isn't who these men are. It's why they were there at all. It is November of 1960, and Richard Milhouse Nixon sits in a television studio knowing something has gone terribly wrong. The sweat on his upper lip, the ill-fitting makeup, the eyes that dart slightly when his opponent flashes that easy smile. John Fitzgerald Kennedy wins the presidency by fewer than 120,000 votes out of nearly 69 million cast. The margin is razor thin, the wound is not. Nixon had spent his entire adult life clawing toward that office. Born in 1913 in Yorba Linda, California, to a struggling Quaker family, he had built himself through sheer grinding will. Congressman, senator, vice president under Eisenhower for 8 years. He had paid his dues, and then a young senator from Massachusetts, with money and charm and that effortless charisma Nixon could never manufacture, took it all away. Most men would have retreated. Nixon did not. He pivoted to California, running for governor in 1962, certain a state victory would keep him relevant, keep him in the game. The voters of California had different ideas. Democrat Pat Brown defeated him by nearly 300,000 votes. It was, by any measure, a humiliation. What happened next became one of the most remarkable press conferences in American political history. Standing before reporters the morning after his defeat, Nixon did not concede gracefully. He attacked. His voice tight with barely controlled fury. He told the assembled press corps, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore, because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." ABC News ran a television special that same evening titled "The Political Obituary of Richard Nixon." The eulogy seemed entirely appropriate. Yet, something in that bitterness, that absolute refusal to accept defeat, was also the engine of his resurrection. Nixon spent the mid-1960s in private legal practice, quietly building political capital, campaigning tirelessly for Republican candidates across the country in 1966. He was collecting debts, building loyalty, assembling the machinery of a comeback nobody in Washington believed was possible. By 1968, the world had cracked open. Martin Luther King murdered in Memphis. Robert Kennedy shot dead in a Los Angeles hotel kitchen. Cities burning. Vietnam consuming American sons by the thousands with no end in sight. Into this chaos stepped Nixon, older now, more controlled, offering something exhausted Americans desperately wanted. Order. Stability. What he called a secret plan to end the war. He won the Republican nomination and, in November of 1968, defeated Vice President Hubert Humphrey to finally claim the prize that had consumed him for nearly a decade. Richard Nixon stood at last in the place he had always believed was his destiny. But the years of defeat, the enemies real and imagined, the siege mentality forged in humiliation, all of it came with him into the White House. The question was never whether those instincts would surface, only when. He arrived in Washington carrying his wounds like weapons. Richard Nixon had always believed the world was arranged against him, and now, holding the most powerful office on earth, that belief did not diminish. It intensified. The men Nixon drew closest to reflected something essential about how he intended to govern. Haldeman, his chief of staff, was a former advertising executive from California, precise and cold, who controlled access to the Oval Office with the efficiency of a machine. John Ehrlichman, his chief domestic advisor, was methodical and unsentimental. Together, they formed what Washington insiders quickly called the Berlin Wall, a barrier between Nixon and the rest of the government, including, often enough, the rest of reality. Attorney General John Mitchell, broad-shouldered and pipe-smoking, brought a prosecutor's instinct for power and its application. And John Dean, the young White House counsel, possessed a lawyer's gift for making uncomfortable arrangements sound procedurally clean. Around these men, a particular atmosphere took hold. Loyalty was not merely expected, it was the only currency that mattered. Aides competed to demonstrate their devotion, their willingness to follow orders without asking the questions that might slow things down. Those who hesitated, who showed independence or doubt, were noted and remembered. The White House in these early years was less an administration than a court, one built on suspicion and hierarchy and the constant management of the president's volcanic resentments. And Nixon's resentments were both specific and encyclopedic. He was convinced the press despised him, that liberal elites in the media and academia had been conspiring against him since his earliest days in politics. He believed the permanent bureaucracy of Washington, the career government officials who had served Democratic administrations, were working quietly to undermine his agenda. These were not entirely irrational fears. But the response to them was something else entirely. In 1971, the White House formalized what had until then been a kind of informal practice. Charles Colson, Nixon's special counsel, began compiling an enemies list, a catalog of political opponents, journalists, academics, and celebrities deemed hostile to the administration. The list would eventually include hundreds of names. The stated purpose was to use the machinery of government to make life difficult for these individuals. As one White House memo bluntly explained, the goal was to use available federal tools to screw our political enemies. Those tools were already being deployed. Nixon ordered the Internal Revenue Service to audit the tax returns of political opponents, a raw abuse of a government agency for personal political vendettas. He approved illegal wiretaps on the phones of journalists and his own National Security Council staff, convinced that leaks to the press were acts of something close to treason. The men carrying out these orders told themselves they were protecting the presidency, protecting the country. That is how it so often begins. What was taking shape inside the Nixon White House was not simply a collection of bad decisions made under pressure. It was a culture systematic and self-reinforcing in which the normal guardrails of democratic governance had been quietly dismantled. The rule of law had not been broken yet, not loudly, not in ways the public could see. But the habits of mind that would eventually shatter it entirely were already fully formed. Everything that followed, the dirty tricks, the cover-ups, the crimes, grew from soil that had been prepared in these first years. The only thing still missing was the moment that would bring it all into the open. That moment was already being planned. On June 13th, 1971, readers of the New York Times opened their Sunday paper to find something extraordinary. 7,000 pages of classified government documents. A secret history of American involvement in Vietnam, commissioned by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, had fallen into the hands of the press. The man who put them there was Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst and Defense Department consultant who had helped write the study and had come to believe the American public had been systematically lied to about the war for decades. Nixon's initial instinct was almost indifferent. The Pentagon Papers, as they came to be known, documented the deceptions of previous administrations, Kennedy's and Johnson's above all. Why should he care? But the men around him, particularly Henry Kissinger, argued that the leak itself was the problem. If a government employee could steal classified documents and hand them to a newspaper without consequence, what would stop the next one? What would stop someone from leaking Nixon's own secrets? That argument landed. Nixon's fury ignited. His administration went to court to block further publication, arguing national security demanded it. For 15 days, the presses stopped. Then the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 against the administration, and the papers continued running. It was a stunning public defeat, and it pushed Nixon towards something darker than legal action. If the courts would not protect him, he would protect himself. In late June of 1971, a small covert unit took shape inside the White House. Formerly called the Special Investigations Unit, it acquired almost immediately a nickname that captured its purpose with grim precision. They were the Plumbers. Their job was to stop leaks, and they were given latitude to do so by whatever means they judged necessary. To run this operation, the White House turned to two men who brought very different qualities to the work. Howard Hunt was a retired CIA operative, a veteran of the Bay of Pigs disaster, a man who had spent his career in the gray spaces where government work becomes something else entirely. Gordon Liddy was a former FBI agent, theatrical and ferociously aggressive, who would later boast that he had held his own hand over an open flame to prove he felt no pain. Together, they were not investigators. They were operatives, and the distinction mattered. Their first major assignment had nothing to do with national security in any recognizable sense. It was personal. Nixon and Kissinger wanted to destroy Daniel Ellsberg's reputation, to reframe him not as a whistleblower, but as a dangerous, unstable man whose motives were corrupt. To find material that might accomplish this, Hunt and Liddy organized a break-in at the Los Angeles office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Dr. Louis Fielding. On the night of September 3, 1971, a team of operatives, several of them Cuban Americans with prior CIA connections, broke into Fielding's office looking for confidential records. They found nothing useful. The operation was a failure by any practical measure. But its significance reached far beyond its outcome. The White House had just authorized a criminal burglary of a private medical office, targeting a private citizen, conducted by covert operatives working directly for the President of the United States. The boundaries that had been quietly eroding since 1969 had now been crossed openly, even if no one outside a small circle knew it yet. The Plumbers were operational. The only question was what they would do next, and who would tell them to stop. No one did. Within months, Hunt and Liddy would bring their methods and their appetite for audacious action to a new project, one with a target not in California, but in Washington itself, inside a gleaming complex of buildings on the banks of the Potomac. By the summer of 1971, Richard Nixon was already thinking about 1972. Despite the turmoil of the Pentagon Papers and the covert world he had authorized inside the White House, his political instincts remained razor-sharp. He had won the presidency in 1968 by fewer than 500,000 votes, a margin so thin it still made him uneasy. He would not leave his re-election to chance. The vehicle for that obsession was the Committee to Re-elect the President, established in the spring of 1971 and quickly abbreviated with unintentional irony as CREEP. On paper, it was a standard campaign operation, raising funds and organizing volunteers. In practice, it became something far more troubling. A parallel government apparatus, answerable not to the Republican Party, not to Congress, not to any public accountability whatsoever, but to Nixon alone. Running it was John Mitchell, one of the most powerful men in Washington. As Attorney General, Mitchell was the nation's chief law enforcement officer, the man responsible for upholding the Constitution. In early 1972, he resigned that position to take formal control of CREEP. The message was unmistakable. The campaign would have the weight and the methods of the Justice Department behind it, and the restraints of that office would no longer apply. Money flowed through CREEP in ways designed to be untraceable. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, some of it collected before new campaign finance laws took effect in April of 1972, passed through Mexican bank accounts and into the hands of operatives. That laundered money would eventually pay for things the public was never meant to know about. One of those things was Donald Segretti. Segretti was a young lawyer, barely 30 years old, recruited by Nixon's appointment secretary Dwight Chapin to run what the White House called a dirty tricks operation against Democratic primary candidates. His assignment was disruption. Through 1971 and into 1972, Segretti and a network of operatives forged letters on Democratic candidates' stationery, planted false accusations, disrupted campaign events, and sowed confusion wherever the primary calendar took them. Their most consequential target was Edmund Muskie of Maine, who entered 1972 as the Democratic frontrunner, a steady and reassuring figure whom Nixon's own pollsters considered the most dangerous opponent the president could face. The operation against Muskie was methodical and cruel. Its most damaging weapon was a forged letter printed on Muskie campaign stationery, alleging that the senator had used a slur against French-Canadian voters by referring to them as Canucks. The letter was published by the Manchester Union Leader in February of 1972. Standing in the snow outside the newspaper's offices, Muskie choked with emotion while defending himself and his wife. Whether he actually wept remains disputed, but the image of a man losing his composure destroyed the narrative of calm competence his campaign had so carefully constructed. His campaign never fully recovered. While Segretti worked at the ground level, Gordon Liddy, now operating through CREEP rather than the White House, was thinking on a grander scale. He presented Mitchell with Operation Gemstone, an extraordinary intelligence plan that included wiretapping, break-ins, the kidnapping of political activists, and elaborate schemes involving yachts and blackmail. The price tag was $1 million. Mitchell reportedly told Liddy the plan was too expensive and asked him to come back with something more modest. What Liddy brought back was still illegal, still audacious, and still catastrophically reckless. One element of it, a simple break-in at Democratic National Committee headquarters, would be selected for approval in the spring of 1972. The target was already chosen. The date would come in June. The room where American democracy began to unravel was an ordinary conference room on the third floor of the Justice Department. It was January of 1972, and Gordon Liddy stood before John Mitchell, White House counsel John Dean, and campaign aide Jeb Stuart Magruder with a set of charts he had prepared himself, each one labeled with a gemstone name. What followed was one of the most extraordinary presentations in American political history. Liddy unveiled Operation Gemstone in full, a cascading fantasy of covert action that read more like a Cold War thriller than a domestic campaign plan. Operation Opal envisioned a private air force. Operation Diamond proposed countering any demonstrations at the Republican convention. But the proposals that left the room speechless were something else entirely. Liddy outlined plans to kidnap radical protest leaders and transport them to Mexico during the Republican convention, removing them from any ability to cause disruption. He described a scheme involving a yacht moored in Miami, where carefully selected women would entertain and compromise Democratic officials. The entire package carried a price tag of $1 million. Mitchell, a man not easily surprised, reportedly listened without visible alarm, then asked Liddy to put his charts away and come back with something more realistic. The kidnapping and prostitution schemes were too expensive, too elaborate, and too dangerous. What Mitchell wanted was intelligence on the Democrats, plain and simple. Liddy returned twice more. Each iteration was trimmed, stripped of its most elaborate fantasies, reduced to something that might actually be executed. By the time Mitchell offered tentative approval in late March of 1972, the operation had narrowed considerably. What remained included wiretapping the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, located in an upscale Washington office and hotel complex called the Watergate. The approval was technically given not in the Justice Department, but in Mitchell's apartment at the Key Biscayne Hotel in Florida. Mitchell would later insist he never gave formal authorization. Dean would remember it differently. What is certain is that the operation moved forward. The men who would actually enter the building were recruited primarily through Howard Hunt, the former CIA officer who had helped plan the Bay of Pigs invasion over a decade earlier. Hunt reached into his network of Cuban-American operatives, men who had participated in covert operations against Fidel Castro and who remained deeply committed to anti-communist causes. Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, and others signed on believing, some of them genuinely, that they were serving national security interests. Frank Sturgis, another veteran of intelligence operations, joined the group. These were not amateurs in the conventional sense. They were men who had broken laws before in service of causes they considered righteous. In late May of 1972, the team successfully entered the Watergate complex for the first time. They photographed documents inside the Democratic National Committee offices and planted listening devices on 2 telephones, one of them belonging to the DNC's chairman, Lawrence O'Brien. It appeared to have gone smoothly. The operation was declared a success. But one of the bugs was not working properly. Intercepted conversations were incomplete, garbled, largely useless. Someone would have to go back in. That decision, made in the weeks that followed, would transform a clumsy act of political espionage into one of the most consequential crimes in American history. The team that had slipped in and out undetected once would return to the Watergate on the night of June 17th. This time, someone would be waiting for them. The night of June 17, 1972 was warm and quiet in Washington. The Watergate complex, with its curved, honeycomb facade overlooking the Potomac River, sat in the kind of comfortable darkness that suggests nothing unusual is happening. Inside the Howard Johnson Motor Lodge directly across the street, Alfred Baldwin sat at a window with a radio scanner, serving as the operations lookout. Below him, somewhere in the elegant corridors of the Watergate office building, 5 men moved silently through the dark. They had been there before. They knew the layout. This was supposed to be routine. What none of them knew was that a 24-year-old security guard named Frank Wills was making his rounds that evening with unusual attention to detail. Shortly after midnight, Wills noticed something small but wrong. A piece of tape had been placed over the latch of a basement door, holding it open to allow re-entry. Wills removed the tape and continued his rounds, assuming it was nothing. The burglars, needing to move between floors, taped the latch again. When Wills passed the same door a second time and found it taped once more, he picked up the phone and called the police. It was, in its way, one of the most consequential phone calls in American political history. 3 plainclothes officers from the Metropolitan Police Department arrived at the Watergate shortly after 2 in the morning on June 18th. They were wearing casual clothes, and Baldwin, watching from his window across the street, initially dismissed them as ordinary pedestrians. He radioed a warning only after the officers had already entered the building, and his message was garbled. The 5 men inside, crouched in the offices of the Democratic National Committee on the 6th floor, had almost no time to react. At 2:30 in the morning, police found them hiding behind desks in the darkened offices. Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, Frank Sturgis, and a man who initially gave his name as Edward Warren were placed under arrest without resistance. What the officers found on these men raised immediate questions. They were carrying sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment, including bugging devices and 2 cameras used to photograph documents. They wore surgical gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, and tucked in their pockets and wallets were crisp $100 bills in sequential order, totaling over $5,000 in cash. These were not ordinary burglars. Sequential bills meant traceable bills, the kind that come from a single organized source. The man who called himself Edward Warren was, in fact, James McCord. And James McCord was not hard to identify once investigators started looking. He was a former CIA officer and, more critically, the security coordinator for the Committee to Re-elect the President, the official campaign organization for Richard Nixon. Reporters from the Washington Post, working through the night and into the following morning, connected those dots within hours. The White House responded to the arrests with a phrase that would itself become famous. Press Secretary Ron Ziegler dismissed the incident as a third-rate burglary attempt, suggesting it warranted no serious attention from the administration. It was a miscalculation of historic proportions. Because the questions did not stop. They multiplied. Why would experienced intelligence operatives risk breaking into a political party's offices? Who had sent them? Who had paid for the sequential $100 bills? And why did one of the arrested men have the phone number of Howard Hunt, a White House consultant, written in his address book? Frank Wills, the security guard whose observant eye had unraveled the entire operation, received a small commendation and returned to work. He would later struggle to find steady employment and became, in some ways, a forgotten figure in a story that would consume the most powerful men in the country. But on that June morning, the machinery of investigation had already begun to turn. 2 young Washington Post reporters named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were assigned to what looked like a routine break-in story. What they would uncover over the months ahead would reach directly into the Oval Office itself. Richard Nixon was in Key Biscayne, Florida when the news reached him. It was the weekend, and the president was resting at his oceanside retreat. His chief of staff, Haldeman, made the call. The details were thin at first, but the name that mattered most came through clearly. James McCord. A man with a direct line to the committee to re-elect the president had been caught inside Democratic Party headquarters with bugging equipment and a wallet full of traceable bills. Nixon's first recorded reaction was not panic. It was calculation. The distance between the president and the Watergate burglars had to be established immediately, and it had to be convincing. Ron Ziegler, stepping before the White House press corps, delivered the administration's official position with practiced dismissiveness. The break-in was, he said, a third-rate burglary attempt. It did not merit a response from the president. It did not merit serious attention from anyone. The reporters in that briefing room were not entirely convinced. Back inside the White House, a 33-year-old lawyer named John Dean was moving with considerably more urgency than Ziegler's performance suggested. Dean was Nixon's counsel, precise and methodical, and he understood within hours what the arrest of James McCord actually meant. The trail did not stop at McCord. It ran through Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, both of whom had organized the operation, and both of whom had connections that pointed directly back toward the White House and the committee financing it. Hunt's name had already appeared in press reports, drawn from the address books of the arrested men. Liddy, the attorney for the re-election committee, was identified within days. Neither man was a peripheral figure. Hunt had served in the CIA for more than 2 decades. Liddy had worked inside the Nixon White House itself. Their involvement transformed a break-in story into something far more dangerous. Dean began making calls. The objective was containment, a word that would echo through the coming months like a drumbeat. Hush money needed to be arranged for the arrested men. Legal counsel needed to be coordinated. Most importantly, the physical evidence needed to disappear. In offices connected to the operation, shredders ran. Files were pulled and destroyed. Howard Hunt's safe at the White House contained documents of particular sensitivity, including materials related to other covert operations that had nothing to do with Watergate, but everything to do with the administration's most closely guarded secrets. Those documents were removed and eventually handed to the acting director of the FBI, L. Patrick Gray, with an instruction that they should never see the light of day. Gray later admitted he burned them. The cover-up was not accidental. It was organized, systematic, and involved senior figures who understood exactly what they were doing. Every document shredded, every phone call coordinated through Dean's office, every payment arranged for the jailed operatives represented a choice. Those choices would prove far more damaging than the break-in itself. What is remarkable, in retrospect, is how quickly the machinery assembled. Within 72 hours of the arrests, the outlines of an obstruction effort were already in place. The administration had closed ranks. The story they intended to tell was simple. Nixon knew nothing. The White House knew nothing. 5 overzealous men had acted on their own. It was a story that required constant maintenance, constant reinforcement, and the cooperation of everyone who knew the truth. Keeping all of those people quiet, it turned out, was considerably harder than shredding documents. As the cover-up took shape behind closed doors, 2 reporters at the Washington Post were beginning to pull at the threads the administration most desperately needed to hold together. 6 days. That was all it took for Richard Nixon to cross the line that would ultimately destroy his presidency. The date was June 23, 1972. Nixon was back in Washington, and H.R. Haldeman arrived in the Oval Office that morning carrying a problem that required a solution only the president could authorize. The FBI's investigation was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Agents were following the money, tracing the bills found on the burglars back toward the committee to re-elect the president, and the trail was getting uncomfortably warm. Something had to be done to slow them down. The conversation that followed lasted less than 30 minutes. It was also recorded on the White House taping system Nixon himself had installed. Haldeman laid out the mechanics of the problem and then offered a remedy. The CIA could be brought in. If agency officials contacted the FBI and suggested that the Watergate investigation risked exposing sensitive national security operations, the Bureau would be legally obligated to pull back. It was a plausible cover. Several of the arrested men had genuine CIA histories, and the connections, however outdated, gave the claim a surface credibility. Nixon did not hesitate. "All right, fine," he told Haldeman. The plan was approved. What happened next moved quickly. CIA Director Richard Helms and his deputy, Vernon Walters, were summoned to a meeting with Haldeman and John Ehrlichman at the White House. The message delivered to them was direct. The FBI's investigation needed to be contained. Walters, as deputy director, should contact acting FBI Director L. Patrick Gray and impress upon him that continuing to follow the money trail would compromise covert CIA operations in Mexico. Helms was skeptical. He told the White House representatives flatly that the CIA had no involvement in Watergate and wanted no part of the obstruction. But Walters, more accommodating, agreed to make the contact. Gray received the call. He was already a compromised figure. having accepted the sensitive documents from Howard Hunt's safe and burned them at the White House's direction. Now, with Walters suggesting that the investigation could damage national security, Gray instructed his agents to stand down from pursuing the Mexico money trail. The FBI's momentum, at least temporarily, was broken. The president had used the Central Intelligence Agency as a weapon against a domestic law enforcement investigation. That was obstruction of justice, and it was recorded on magnetic tape in precise, unambiguous detail. For 2 years, none of this was known publicly. The tapes existed, but their contents were Nixon's secret. Even as the Senate Watergate committee convened, even as special prosecutors pressed closer, even as the walls of the cover-up cracked and crumbled, the June 23rd recording sat in its archive. Nixon knew it was there. He knew what it contained. When the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in July of 1974 that Nixon could not claim executive privilege to withhold the tapes, the recording was finally transcribed and released to the public on August 5th. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Nixon's own defense, constructed across 2 years of denials and carefully managed revelations, collapsed in a single afternoon. Here was the president's voice, 6 days after the break-in, directing the use of the CIA to obstruct federal investigators. Republicans who had defended Nixon through impeachment hearings withdrew their support within hours. The 10 members of the House Judiciary Committee who had voted against every article of impeachment announced they had changed their positions. There was nothing left to argue. The tape became known as the smoking gun, a phrase that entered the language permanently. It was not merely evidence of wrongdoing. It was proof that the cover-up had been presidential in origin from nearly the very beginning. Nixon had not stumbled into obstruction of justice. He had chosen it calmly on a Tuesday morning in June while the tape reels turned silently in the walls around him. What remained now was the question that would consume the following months. How long could the cover-up survive before the men who knew the truth decided they had reasons of their own to start talking? The answer, it turned out, was money. As long as the money kept flowing, the silence would hold. In the weeks following the break-in, John Dean, the White House counsel, became the architect of a parallel operation running beneath the official surface of American government. His task was brutally simple: keep 7 men quiet through the November election. What that required in practice was cash. Large amounts of it delivered discreetly, with no paper trail connecting it back to the men in the West Wing who authorized the payments. The machinery assembled to accomplish this was elaborate by necessity. Nixon's personal attorney and trusted fundraiser, Herbert Kalmbach, was recruited as the primary courier. Kalmbach, a careful and respected lawyer, was deeply uncomfortable with what he was being asked to do. He asked Dean directly whether the payments were legal and whether they had the president's approval. Dean assured him on both counts. Satisfied, or at least willing to accept that assurance, Kalmbach got to work. The cash came from campaign funds collected before new financial disclosure laws took effect. It moved through intermediaries, changed hands in hotel lobbies and parking garages, and arrived in plain envelopes, sometimes brown paper, sometimes nothing more than a manila fold. Defendants received money for living expenses, legal fees, and the understood price of continued silence. Then came the complication that threatened to unravel everything. Howard Hunt, the veteran CIA operative who had helped plan the break-in, was not a patient man. He was facing federal prosecution. His wife had died in a plane crash in December, and he had spent years in intelligence work accumulating knowledge that was, in his estimation, worth something substantial. In late 1972 and into the following year, Hunt began sending messages through his attorney. He wanted more money. Considerably more. And he suggested, with a clarity no one could mistake, that his memory of other activities, Operations extending well beyond Watergate might become unreliable without adequate compensation. The threat landed in the White House like a stone in still water. Dean brought it directly to Nixon in March of 1973, in a conversation that was itself recorded. The cost of keeping Hunt silent, Dean told the president, could reach $1 million over time. Nixon's response was not outrage. It was practical calculation. You could get $1 million, Nixon said, and you could get it in cash. The implication was clear. Find a way. By the time the November election arrived, more than $400,000 had been paid to the defendants and their families. Hunt received the largest share. The payments had flowed quietly, invisibly, through layers of cutouts designed to absorb any investigation before it could reach the Oval Office. The strategy worked, at least on the timetable that mattered most to Nixon. On November 7, 1972, he won re-election by one of the largest margins in American political history, carrying 49 states and winning over 60% of the popular vote. The Watergate break-in had been successfully quarantined. Most voters knew the name but felt no particular alarm. The Washington Post had continued investigating through the fall, but its stories had failed to penetrate beyond a narrow readership of the already attentive. The cover-up machine had done its job. But machines require maintenance, and the people running this one were beginning to show the strain. Kalmbach was quietly horrified by what he had done. The defendants, despite their payments, were heading toward trial, and the federal prosecutors pursuing the case had no intention of accepting the story that 7 men had organized a sophisticated intelligence operation entirely on their own initiative. The silence that money had purchased was not permanent. It had an expiration date, and in the new year, that date was approaching fast. November 7th, 1972. The returns came in early, and they came in decisively. Richard Nixon won 49 states. He carried Massachusetts and the District of Columbia for his opponent, and nothing else. George McGovern, the Democratic senator from South Dakota, had run a campaign rooted in opposition to the Vietnam War and a vision of sweeping social reform that excited the party's left wing and almost no one else. Nixon won 520 electoral votes to McGovern's 17. He captured more than 60% of the popular vote. It was, by almost any measure, one of the most crushing electoral victories in the history of the American presidency. How had the Democrats arrived at McGovern? The party had spent the summer of 1972 consumed by its own internal battles. New rules, reformed after the chaos of the '68 convention, had opened the nomination process to activists and idealists. McGovern had mastered those rules brilliantly, winning the nomination while alienating union leaders, moderate voters, and much of the party establishment. His general election campaign never recovered from an early stumble over his running mate and never found a message that resonated in a country that, whatever its doubts about Nixon, was not yet ready for the politics McGovern represented. And Watergate? It barely registered. Polls throughout the fall showed that most Americans had heard the word but assigned it little weight. The break-in seemed like a strange, isolated incident, the work of overzealous operatives rather than evidence of something systemic. Nixon's team had successfully framed it as a partisan distraction, and the majority of voters were inclined to agree. The Washington Post kept pressing. Through October and into November, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein continued publishing stories connecting the break-in to the broader campaign intelligence operation and to money flowing from the committee to re-elect the president. Their reporting was careful and well-sourced. It was also, during those weeks, largely ignored. Other major news organizations were slow to follow. The White House dismissed the coverage as political attacks by a hostile press. The strategy of aggressive denial was holding. Inside the White House after the landslide, The mood was something close to euphoria, with an edge of something more dangerous: invulnerability. Nixon and his inner circle had survived the summer's crisis, buried the story through an election, and received a mandate from the American people of extraordinary size. The cover-up had worked. The enemy had been routed. What could possibly threaten them now? That confidence would prove to be the most consequential miscalculation of Nixon's presidency. The landslide had not erased Watergate. It had simply postponed the reckoning. And in the federal courthouse in Washington, a judge named John Sirica was preparing to oversee the trial of the 7 defendants who, come January, would face a justice system with its own momentum and its own stubborn appetite for truth. While Richard Nixon celebrated his landslide, 2 young reporters at the Washington Post were doing something the rest of official Washington was not. They were working. Bob Woodward was 29 years old. Carl Bernstein was 28. Neither was a senior correspondent. Neither had the kind of established reputation that would normally accompany a story of this magnitude. Woodward had been at the Post for less than a year when he was dispatched to cover what seemed, on June 17, 1972, like a routine arraignment. Bernstein was a college dropout who had spent years proving himself through sheer tenacity. Together, they were an unlikely pair. Together, they became something historic. Their editor, Ben Bradley, had built the Post into a serious national paper. He was 61 years old in 1972, a former Navy officer with a reporter's instinct for a genuine story. When Woodward and Bernstein brought him evidence connecting the Watergate burglars to the committee to re-elect the president, Bradley did not flinch. When the White House threatened the Post's broadcasting licenses, when Nixon allies publicly attacked the paper's credibility, when pressure arrived from sources with real power to apply it, Bradley backed his reporters. Without that institutional support, the story dies. With it, the story grew. But how did 2 young journalists, without subpoena power or official standing, manage to trace a conspiracy that the Justice Department and the FBI were actively helping to conceal? The answer arrived in a parking garage. Woodward had a source. The arrangement was unconventional and deliberately obscure, built around a system of signals, late-night meetings, and a level of tradecraft more associated with espionage than journalism. The source told Woodward to follow the money. He confirmed leads, redirected dead ends, and warned when the reporters were walking into danger. The world knew him only as Deep Throat, a nickname borrowed from a notorious film of the era. For 33 years, his identity remained one of Washington's most jealously guarded secrets. Then, in 2005, a 91-year-old man named W. Mark Felt told the world it had been him all along. Felt had been the deputy director of the FBI. He had expected to succeed J. Edgar Hoover upon Hoover's death in May of 1972. Nixon had passed him over. What drove Felt? Whether genuine conviction, institutional loyalty, or personal grievance, historians still debate. What he provided was access to the inner workings of an investigation being deliberately obstructed from above. He knew where the bodies were buried because he had watched the shovels at work. Through the fall of 1972 and into 1973, Woodward and Bernstein published story after story. They traced laundered money from a Mexican bank account to the burglars' wallets. They named White House officials with direct connections to the sabotage operation. They revealed that the break-in was not an isolated act, but one piece of a systematic campaign of political espionage and dirty tricks. Most of official Washington looked away. Most news organizations moved slowly, reluctant to follow a story the White House was calling a fabrication. But the Post kept publishing, and the record kept accumulating, and the story refused to disappear. The Nixon administration had calculated that they could outlast the coverage, discredit the reporters, and exhaust the public's attention. It was a strategy that required everything to hold together. And in a federal courtroom in Washington, presided over by a tough, skeptical judge named John Sirica, the pressure on the men who knew the truth was about to become something none of them had fully anticipated. John Sirica was not a man who accepted things at face value. The chief judge of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia had earned his nickname, Maximum John, through decades of handing down sentences that left little room for ambiguity. He was 69 years old when the Watergate burglars appeared before him in January of 1973, and he looked at the 7 defendants with the settled conviction of a man who had heard too many incomplete stories in his courtroom. The proceedings began on January 8th. 5 of the 7 defendants chose not to risk a jury's verdict. Howard Hunt and 4 of the Cuban operatives, Bernard Barker, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis, entered guilty pleas. The courtroom watched, and reporters wrote their dispatches, and official Washington prepared to draw a line beneath the whole affair. Sirica refused to draw that line. The 2 remaining defendants, G. Gordon Liddy and James McCord, went to trial before a jury. The evidence against them was substantial. The jury's deliberations were brief. And on January 30, 1973, both men were convicted on all counts. The White House could point to the outcome as proof the system had worked. 7 men had been charged. 7 men had been held accountable. Case closed. But watching from the bench, Sirica was openly, publicly unconvinced. He told the courtroom that he was not satisfied the full truth had emerged. He pointed out that the trial had produced no serious examination of who had ordered the break-in, who had paid for it, and why. The defendants had offered explanations that explained almost nothing. The judge found that remarkable. Then came the pressure. Sirica announced that he was considering sentences of up to 40 years for the convicted men, numbers that concentrated the mind with considerable efficiency. He was not, he made clear, simply punishing the defendants for their crimes. He was creating an incentive structure. Cooperation with investigators could be considered when final sentences arrived. Silence would not be rewarded. It was an unconventional use of judicial authority, and it drew criticism. But Sirica understood something that prosecutors and politicians had chosen not to examine too closely. The men sitting before him were not freelancers. They were operatives, and operatives answer to someone. The question was whether any of them would decide that 40 years in a federal prison outweighed whatever loyalty or fear was keeping them quiet. For weeks, the answer seemed to be no. The White House continued to insist the investigation had run its course. The 7 defendants absorbed the pressure in silence, waiting for promises that had apparently been made to be kept. But promises made inside a conspiracy carry a particular fragility. And James McCord, a former CIA officer staring at the prospect of years behind bars, was about to reach for a pen and paper. What he wrote next would crack the silence open for good. The letter was handwritten. James McCord, a former officer of the Central Intelligence Agency, a man who had spent his career inside the architecture of American secrets, sat down and composed a document that would reshape the presidency. He addressed it to Judge John Sirica. He sent it on March 19, 1973. And on March 23rd, Sirica read it aloud in open court. The silence in that courtroom must have been extraordinary. McCord's words were precise and devastating. He alleged that the Watergate defendants had been subjected to political pressure to plead guilty and remain silent. He alleged that perjury had been committed during the trial. And then he delivered the sentence that stopped official Washington cold. Higher-ups were involved, he wrote. People whose names had not appeared in any indictment, whose offices sat inside the White House itself. The cover-up, so carefully assembled over the preceding months, had just developed its first fatal crack. Consider what McCord understood in that moment. He had watched the promises of financial support and eventual clemency hover just out of reach. He had watched the White House distance itself from men it had deployed. He had stared at the prospect of carrying the full weight of a conspiracy that reached far above him while the men responsible walked free. And so he wrote his letter. Not to prosecutors, not to journalists, but to the one man in the proceeding who had made clear he was not satisfied with the story he had been told. Sirica had given McCord an opening. McCord walked through it. The political consequences began cascading almost immediately. The Senate of the United States had already been watching the Watergate proceedings with mounting unease. Now, with McCord's allegations ricocheting through Washington, the pressure to act became irresistible. The Senate voted to establish a select investigative committee, a vote so overwhelming it left no room for interpretation. The final tally was 77-0. Not a single senator was willing to stand against it. The committee would be chaired by Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, a white-haired constitutional scholar who had a gift for making complex legal questions sound like plain moral ones. The White House was watching all of this with growing alarm. And inside the West Wing, one man was calculating his own survival with particular urgency. John Dean had served as counsel to the president. He had been, in many respects, the administrative backbone of the cover-up, the man who coordinated payments, managed communications, and kept the various threads from visibly unraveling. He knew where everything was buried because he had helped bury it. And now, as McCord's letter transformed the political landscape, Dean began making a different kind of calculation. In the weeks following March 23rd, Dean opened quiet channels to federal prosecutors. He was not prepared to go to prison for decisions made above him. He wanted to negotiate. And what he had to offer was something no amount of White House pressure could neutralize. He had knowledge, specific and detailed, of conversations that had taken place in the Oval Office itself. Richard Nixon, meanwhile, had spent weeks reassuring himself that the containment was holding. It was not holding. The men around him were beginning to understand that the mathematics of loyalty had shifted. When Dean began cooperating, the president lost the one person who could have described, in granular detail, exactly what Nixon knew and when he had known it. The cover-up had been constructed on the assumption that everyone would hold. McCord had demonstrated that the assumption was wrong. And once one man decided that silence was no longer in his interest, the incentive for everyone else to keep quiet began to dissolve. March 1973 did not end the Nixon presidency. That would take another 17 months. But it ended the possibility of a quiet resolution. The dam had broken, and what was coming through the gap would eventually sweep everything before it. The question now was how much of the truth would emerge, and who would be left standing when it did. The Senate's new committee was about to provide a very public stage for finding out. On the morning of March 21st, 1973, John Dean walked into the Oval Office carrying information he believed the president needed to hear directly. What followed was one of the most consequential conversations in American political history, and though neither man knew it then, it was being recorded. Dean did not soften his message. The cover-up, he told Nixon, had become a cancer on the presidency. It was growing, metastasizing, and if nothing was done to remove it, it would consume everything. The men who had participated in the conspiracy required money to stay silent. Howard Hunt, one of the original burglars, was demanding more. Dean put a figure to it, Roughly $1 million would be needed to keep all the defendants quiet over the next 2 years. Nixon's response was not outrage. It was not a firm refusal. Instead, he engaged with the problem in the manner of a man who had been managing it for months. He asked how such money might be raised. He suggested that $1 million was not an impossible sum. The conversation continued along these lines for more than an hour, two men in the most powerful office in the world discussing the logistics of obstruction. Dean left that meeting with a deepening sense of dread, and not only about the cover-up itself. He was beginning to see his own position with uncomfortable clarity. The White House, Dean understood, needed someone to absorb the blame when the full story finally broke open. He had been present at meetings. He had made phone calls. He had coordinated payments. On paper, and perhaps in the testimony of others, he could be made to look like the architect of the entire scheme rather than one participant among many. The men above him, including the president himself, would point downward. Dean would be left exposed. That calculation changed everything. Within days of the March 21st meeting, Dean made a decision that would alter the course of the entire investigation. He hired a criminal defense attorney. The choice of counsel was itself a signal, one that the White House could not ignore. Innocent men coordinating the administration's legal response to a burglary did not typically require personal criminal lawyers. Then Dean began talking to federal prosecutors. What he offered them was extraordinary. He had been inside the room, literally and figuratively, for months of conspiracy. He could describe conversations with specificity. He could name names and explain decisions. He could provide the Justice Department with a map of the cover-up drawn by someone who had helped design it. In exchange, he was looking for protection, some assurance that his cooperation would be weighed against his exposure. The prosecutors listened very carefully. Dean's defection represented something qualitatively different from McCord's letter. McCord had pointed at the door and said that powerful men were behind it. Dean could open the door and describe exactly what was inside. He was not peripheral to the conspiracy. He was central to it, and his willingness to cooperate meant that the prosecution now had a potential witness capable of placing responsibility at the highest levels of the executive branch. The cover-up had been built on a simple and ultimately fragile premise that loyalty, money, and the promise of clemency would hold the line. McCord had shown that the line could break. Dean showed that once it broke, the men who had been behind it would turn on each other with remarkable speed. Richard Nixon would spend the coming weeks trying to manage the damage, to identify the acceptable sacrifices, to construct a new version of events that might still protect the presidency. He would not succeed. The Senate Select Committee was preparing to open its hearings, and John Dean was preparing to testify. By the final days of April 1973, Richard Nixon had run out of options. The men who had served as his most loyal defenders, the aides who had insulated him from the ugliest details of his own administration, would now have to go. HR. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman had been called the Berlin Wall by those who worked around them. Tough, disciplined, and fiercely protective of the president's time and reputation, they had controlled access to the Oval Office for more than 4 years. Now Nixon summoned them separately and told each man that his resignation was necessary. The conversations, by all accounts, were agonizing. These were not political functionaries to be discarded without feeling. They were, in whatever sense the word applied to Nixon, friends. Attorney General Richard Kleindienst, who had recused himself from the Watergate investigation months earlier, also submitted his resignation. He had known too many of the people involved. The appearance of independence at the Justice Department was no longer possible with him in place. John Dean, whose decision to cooperate with prosecutors had already reordered the entire landscape of the investigation, was not offered the dignity of resignation. He was fired. On the evening of April 30th, Nixon addressed the nation from the Oval Office. The speech was watched by tens of millions of Americans. Nixon looked drained. He described Haldeman and Ehrlichman as two of the finest public servants he had ever known. Words that must have struck many viewers as strange, given that both men were now ensnared in a criminal investigation. He accepted responsibility in the broadest and most abstract terms while attributing the specific crimes to others, to subordinates who had acted without his knowledge. It was a formulation that satisfied almost no one. The moment that drew the most attention came near the end. Nixon's voice faltered. For a brief few seconds, the most powerful figure in American politics appeared close to tears. Whether genuine or calculated, the display of emotion underscored just how dramatically his position had deteriorated in the months since 5 men were arrested inside the Watergate complex. One appointment from that evening carried particular significance. Nixon named Elliot Richardson as the new Attorney General and, under intense political pressure, authorized Richardson to appoint an independent special prosecutor to oversee the Watergate investigation. It was an acknowledgement that the Justice Department could no longer credibly investigate the executive branch from within. Richardson would later select Archibald Cox, a Harvard law professor and former Solicitor General, for the role. Nixon had hoped that sacrificing his closest aides would draw a line, that the exposure of individuals below him would satisfy investigators and the public alike. It would not. The appointment of a special prosecutor with genuine independence meant that the investigation now had a mandate that no one inside the White House could easily control. The walls were not closing in. They had already closed. The first gavel fell on May 17, 1973. In a high-ceilinged Senate hearing room packed with reporters, cameras, and spectators, Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina called the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities to order. What followed would hold an entire nation transfixed for months. Ervin was 76 years old, a self-described simple country lawyer whose folksy manner concealed one of the sharpest constitutional minds in the Senate. He quoted scripture and Shakespeare with equal ease. He raised his eyebrows theatrically when a witness said something he found implausible, which turned out to be often. Americans who had never paid close attention to Washington politics found themselves scheduling their afternoons around his committee sessions. The 3 major networks broadcast the hearings live, and PBS rebroadcast them each evening for viewers who had missed the daytime proceedings. Bars opened early. Office workers gathered around television sets in break rooms. By the end of the summer, an estimated 80% of Americans had watched some portion of the proceedings. The numbers were staggering for a congressional hearing, the kind of audience usually reserved for moon landings and championship games. Witness after witness climbed into the chair beside the long committee table. Jeb Stuart Magruder, the deputy campaign director for Nixon's re-election effort, spoke with the smooth delivery of a man who had rehearsed his contrition carefully. He confirmed that the Watergate break-in had been approved at senior levels, and that the subsequent cover-up had been deliberate and organized. Herbert Kalmbach, Nixon's personal attorney, described his role in raising and distributing hush money to the original burglars, cash delivered in paper bags in hotel lobbies across the country. Each account added another layer to a picture that grew more troubling with every sitting. Then came John Dean. Beginning on June 25th, Dean sat before the committee for 5 consecutive days. He brought with him a prepared opening statement running to 245 pages, a document he read aloud in full in a measured, almost bureaucratic voice that somehow made its contents more alarming rather than less. Dean described a White House engaged in systematic criminal activity, and he placed Richard Nixon at the center of it. not as a distant figure who had been misled by subordinates, but as an active participant in the obstruction of justice. The nation watched a 34-year-old man dismantle his former employer's presidency one precise sentence at a time. Dean had the unsettling quality of someone recounting a business meeting rather than confessing involvement in federal crimes. He was calm. He was detailed. He remembered dates, room numbers, specific phrases from conversations. His demeanor carried its own kind of authority. Republicans on the committee attacked his credibility relentlessly. How could he be trusted? What had he been promised in exchange for his cooperation? But Dean had anticipated the assault. His answers were careful and consistent, and when he acknowledged his own wrongdoing openly and without apparent self-pity, he became paradoxically harder to dismiss. Could one man's testimony bring down a presidency? The White House insisted Dean was a liar protecting himself at his former colleague's expense. The problem was that Magruder, Kalmbach, and others had already told stories that fit alongside Dean's with uncomfortable precision. Summer turned toward autumn with no resolution in sight. The hearings had transformed public understanding of what Watergate actually was. Not a bungled break-in, but a systematic abuse of power reaching into the Oval Office itself. Americans now knew the broad shape of the crime. What they did not yet know was that somewhere inside the White House, the most important evidence of all had been quietly recording every conversation for years. The answer arrived, as so many turning points do, almost by accident. On July 13th, 1973, Senate committee staff members conducted a routine pre-interview with Alexander Butterfield, a former White House aide who had served as deputy assistant to the president. They expected little of consequence. Butterfield was an administrative figure, a man who managed the internal machinery of the West Wing rather than sitting in on strategy sessions. But one question stopped the interview cold. Had there been any system in place, the investigators asked, to record or document Oval Office conversations? Butterfield paused. Then he confirmed what the investigators had not genuinely expected to hear. Since February of 1971, the White House had operated a voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office, the Cabinet Room, and several other locations, including the president's private retreat at Camp David and his phones. Every conversation, every meeting, every unguarded moment of the Nixon presidency had been captured on magnetic tape. 3 days later, on July 16th, Butterfield sat before the full Senate committee and delivered this information to the watching nation. The hearing room, usually charged with the particular energy of Washington theatrics, fell into something closer to stunned quiet. Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, whose famous question about what the president knew and when he knew it had already become the defining frame of the investigation, now understood that the question might actually have an answer. The implications were breathtaking. John Dean had spent 5 days insisting that Nixon had known about the cover-up and had participated in directing it. Nixon had spent the same period insisting Dean was lying. Until this moment, the country had been watching two men contradict each other with no way to resolve the dispute. Now, suddenly, the tapes existed. The truth, whatever it was, had been speaking into a microphone for more than 2 years. Both the Senate committee and Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox moved immediately. They wanted the tapes. The demand was simple and the logic behind it was irresistible. If Nixon was innocent, the recordings would prove it. If he was not, the American people had a right to know. Nixon refused. The president's lawyers invoked executive privilege, The principle that a president must be able to receive candid advice and conduct sensitive deliberations without fear that those conversations will be exposed. They argued that handing over the tapes would permanently damage the institution of the presidency, setting a precedent that would chill every future administration. They added national security concerns, suggesting some recordings touched on matters too sensitive for congressional consumption. Critics heard something else in these arguments. If the tapes exonerated the president, why not release them? The decision to fight their disclosure, rather than welcome it, struck many observers as the most telling detail of all. What followed was a constitutional battle unlike anything the country had witnessed in the modern era. A special prosecutor, appointed by the executive branch itself, was now demanding documents from that same branch. A president was claiming the authority to withhold evidence from a criminal investigation. The courts would have to decide where the limits of presidential power actually lay, a question the framers of the Constitution had never anticipated needing to answer quite this directly. The legal skirmishing would grind forward through the late summer and into the fall, the subpoenas and briefs and court filings accumulating into a paper record of a republic testing its own foundations. Americans found themselves in unfamiliar territory, reading about executive privilege and separation of powers not as abstract civics lessons, but as the immediate stakes of a national crisis. The tapes existed. The courts would decide their fate. And somewhere in the White House, those reels continued to turn, recording a presidency in the process of destroying itself. The confrontation between Nixon and the investigators demanding those recordings was building toward a breaking point. When it arrived, it would not come quietly. It would come on a Saturday night in October, and it would shake Washington to its foundations in a way that even the summer's revelations had not prepared the country for. The breaking point arrived on a Saturday. By October of 1973, Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox had spent months navigating the legal architecture of his demand for the White House recordings. Cox was not a political creature by nature. A Harvard law professor with a quiet, almost academic bearing, he had accepted the role of special prosecutor in May on the understanding that he would operate independently of White House interference. He took that understanding seriously. Cox had subpoenaed 9 specific tape recordings, conversations that prosecutors believed would either confirm or demolish the case against the president. Nixon, still refusing to surrender the actual recordings, proposed what his team considered a reasonable compromise. The White House would prepare edited summaries of the relevant conversations, and Senator John Stennis of Mississippi, a respected Democrat known for his discretion, would listen to the tapes and verify that the summaries were accurate. Cox rejected it. Summaries were not evidence. A senator listening in private was not a court. The integrity of any prosecution built on secondhand characterizations of recordings that no jury could ever hear would be fatally compromised from the start. On the afternoon of Friday, October 19th, Cox held a press conference and explained his refusal with the careful precision of a man who understood exactly what he was doing. He was not backing down. Nixon had heard enough. That evening, he issued a direct order to Attorney General Elliot Richardson: fire Cox. What happened next revealed something important about the country that produced these men. Richardson had promised the Senate during his own confirmation hearings that he would protect the special prosecutor's independence. He had made that promise as a condition of his appointment. Faced with the order to break it, Richardson chose his promise over his position. He resigned. Nixon turned to the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus. The same order. The same result. Ruckelshaus refused and was dismissed. The task fell finally to Solicitor General Robert Bork, the third-ranking official in the Justice Department. Bork had not made the same promises as Richardson. He carried out the firing on the evening of October 20th, 1973. The White House also moved to shut down the special prosecutor's office, with FBI agents arriving to seal the files before investigators could remove them. The country woke to the news on Sunday morning. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Congressional offices were flooded with calls and telegrams, some estimates putting the total above 300,000 in the days that followed. The word impeachment, which had circulated in whispers through the summer, was now spoken plainly on the floors of Congress. Even Republicans who had defended the president found themselves struggling to explain what they had witnessed. The Saturday Night Massacre, as it would be immediately and permanently named, accomplished something that months of Senate hearings and legal filings had not quite managed. It made the abstract concrete. Americans had watched a president order the firing of the man investigating him, watched two honorable officials refuse and step aside rather than comply, and watched the government's own files placed under seal. Whatever complicated feelings the country had held about Watergate through the spring and summer, the events of that single October evening cut through them. Nixon had sought to end the investigation. Instead, he had ensured it would intensify beyond anything he had yet faced. New special prosecutors would be appointed. The courts would accelerate their review of the tape subpoenas. And in Congress, the machinery of impeachment, slow and constitutional and deliberate, was finally beginning to move. The question was no longer whether the president had enemies. The question was whether the tapes would confirm what his enemies believed. The telegrams came by the hundreds of thousands. More than 450,000 of them flooded into congressional offices in the days following the Saturday Night Massacre, an avalanche of public fury unlike anything Washington had seen in living memory. Impeachment resolutions, 84 of them, were introduced in the House within weeks. The abstract had become urgent. Nixon needed a new special prosecutor, and he needed one quickly. The man who emerged was Leon Jaworski, a 68-year-old Texas attorney with a distinguished career in law and a reputation for quiet, methodical tenacity. Unlike Cox, Jaworski carried no association with the Kennedy Circle, no ideological coloring that the White House could exploit. Nixon's advisors believed they had found someone manageable. They had badly misread him. But before Jaworski could fully settle into his new role, a discovery emerged from the White House that would become one of the most enduring mysteries of the entire scandal. On November 14, 1973, technicians examining the subpoenaed tape recordings made a stunning announcement. A crucial conversation from June 20th, 1972, recorded just 3 days after the Watergate break-in, contained a gap. Not a brief pause or a moment of static. A gap of 18.5 minutes, a sustained, buzzing erasure at precisely the moment when Nixon and his chief of staff HR, Haldeman, had discussed the unfolding crisis. The question hung in the air like smoke. How does 18.5 minutes simply disappear? Rosemary Woods, Nixon's loyal personal secretary for more than 2 decades, offered an explanation. She demonstrated for photographers how she might have accidentally held down a record button while simultaneously reaching for a telephone, her body stretched in an almost impossible contortion that the press immediately dubbed the Rosemary Stretch. Expert analysis of the tape would later conclude that the erasure had been made not once but at least 5 separate times, requiring repeated, deliberate action. The accident theory did not survive serious scrutiny. The president, under siege from every direction, made a decision that would echo through history. On the evening of November 17, 1973, speaking before 400 Associated Press managing editors gathered in Orlando, Florida, Nixon addressed the mounting accusations directly. His voice steady, his jaw set, he delivered the line that would define him for generations. "I am not a crook." The words were meant to reassure. Instead, they achieved the opposite. No president in American history had ever needed to make such a declaration. The very act of saying it planted the phrase in the public imagination with a permanence that no speechwriter could have anticipated or any president would have wanted. By the close of 1973, the walls were unmistakably closing. The courts were pressing for more tapes, Congress was pressing for answers, and Leon Jaworski was pressing forward with the quiet resolve of a man who had no intention of being managed. The question of what those recordings contained and what they might prove was about to become the central drama of 1974. By the first day of March 1974, the legal machinery that had been grinding forward for nearly 2 years finally produced its most dramatic results yet. A federal grand jury handed down indictments against 7 of Nixon's closest former associates, including Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and former Attorney General John Mitchell. The charges were serious: obstruction of justice, perjury, conspiracy. These were not peripheral figures or low-level operatives. These were the men who had stood at the very center of American power. But the grand jury did something else that day, something the public would not learn for months. In a sealed recommendation, the jurors named Richard Nixon himself as an unindicted co-conspirator. The word unindicted was a legal distinction, not an exoneration. The special prosecutor's office had concluded that a sitting president could not be indicted while in office. But the designation meant something profound. The grand jury believed the evidence pointed directly at Nixon, and they wanted that fact on the record. The walls were no longer closing. They had arrived. In May, the House Judiciary Committee, chaired by New Jersey Democrat Peter Rodino, opened formal impeachment hearings. For the first time in more than a century, the United States Congress was seriously considering removing a sitting president. The proceedings were televised, and Americans watched with a mixture of fascination and dread as their democratic institutions were tested in ways the founders had imagined but never wished upon their descendants. Nixon's response was carefully calculated and ultimately catastrophic. Rather than release the actual tape recordings subpoenaed by the committee, he offered a compromise: edited transcripts. 1,200 pages of conversations, printed and bound, delivered to Congress, and simultaneously released to the public. The White House announced it as a gesture of unprecedented transparency. What it actually delivered was something far more damaging. The transcripts were riddled with a phrase that would immediately enter the American vocabulary: expletive deleted. Wherever Nixon or his aides had used profanity, the words had been replaced by that clinical, sanitized placeholder. But the phrase, appearing dozens and then hundreds of times across the pages, conjured in the reader's imagination something rawer and uglier than the actual words might have. Here was the Oval Office as it actually sounded. Here was the presidency stripped of its ceremonial dignity. Worse still was what the expletives surrounded. The transcripts revealed a president who was scheming, calculating, and consumed by self-preservation. The discussions about Watergate were not the anguished deliberations of a leader wrestling with the truth. They were the transactional conversations of men working out how to survive. Even Hugh Scott, the Republican Senate Minority Leader who had spent months defending Nixon, read the transcripts and pronounced them, with visible dismay, disgusting. Supporters who had given Nixon every benefit of the doubt now found themselves confronted with his own words. The carefully constructed image of a president wronged by political enemies began to fracture under the weight of the transcripts themselves. The man in those pages did not sound wronged. He sounded guilty. Through the spring of 1974, the impeachment hearings continued, the subpoenas multiplied, and Leon Jaworski pressed his demand for the actual tapes, not edited versions selected by the president's own lawyers. Nixon refused. The battle over those recordings was now heading toward the only institution with the authority to settle it once and for all: the Supreme Court of the United States. The question had never been asked so directly before. Could a president of the United States refuse a lawful court order by claiming the presidency itself placed him beyond its reach? Leon Jaworski, convinced that the answer would define the republic, made a bold procedural move. He petitioned to bring the tapes case directly before the Supreme Court, bypassing the normal appeals process entirely. The court agreed to hear it. Time was running short, and everyone understood it. Oral arguments were heard on July 8, 1974. For 3 hours, justices pressed both sides with pointed, searching questions. James St. Clair, arguing for Nixon, contended that executive privilege was absolute. A president, he maintained, could not be compelled by any court to surrender confidential communications. The separation of powers demanded nothing less. The justices were not persuaded. 16 days later, on July the 24th, the Supreme Court delivered its answer. The vote was 8-0. Chief Justice Warren Burger, a Nixon appointee, wrote the opinion himself, perhaps to underscore the independence of the judiciary from the man who had placed him on the bench. The ruling was unsparing. Executive privilege, Burger wrote, was a legitimate constitutional principle. But it was not absolute. It could not be invoked simply to shield evidence in a criminal proceeding. And no person, the court declared, not even the President of the United States, stood above the law. 8-0. Not a single dissent. Not even a hesitation. The ruling landed in Washington like a thunderclap on a clear afternoon. Nixon's lawyers had privately hoped for something closer, perhaps 5-3, perhaps even a narrow defeat that might offer some rhetorical lifeline. What they received instead was a verdict without ambiguity, without refuge, without any seam through which a legal argument might be threaded. The court had not ruled against Richard Nixon. It had ruled against the very theory upon which his defense rested. Nixon complied. He had no realistic choice. On the same afternoon the ruling came down, the White House announced the president would turn over the subpoenaed recordings. The announcement was brief, almost clinical in its language, entirely stripped of the defiance that had characterized 2 years of resistance. He knew what was on those tapes. His lawyers knew. His closest remaining advisors knew. And now, with the recordings no longer his to withhold, the country was about to know as well. The tapes would reach the special prosecutor's office, be reviewed by his staff, and then a specific recording would surface that would do what no grand jury indictment, no congressional hearing, and no newspaper investigation had quite managed to accomplish. It would eliminate any remaining doubt about what Richard Nixon had known and when he had known it. The countdown had begun. Within days, the tape recorded on June the 23rd, 1972, would become the most consequential piece of audio evidence in American political history. On August the 5th, 1974, the White House released the transcripts of 3 conversations recorded on June the 23rd, 1972, just 6 days after the Watergate break-in. What the country read that morning ended the presidency of Richard Nixon as surely as any formal verdict ever could. The recordings were devastating in their clarity. Nixon could be heard directing his chief of staff, Haldeman, to instruct the CIA to block the FBI's investigation of the break-in, not to slow it, not to redirect it. to stop it entirely, using the agency's national security authority as a false pretext. The obstruction of justice was not implied, not inferred, not assembled from fragments. It was there, in Nixon's own voice, mapped out in plain language within days of the crime itself. The political collapse was immediate and total. The 11 Republican members of the House Judiciary Committee who had voted against impeachment reversed their positions overnight. Men who had spent weeks defending the president, who had appeared on television insisting the evidence remained incomplete, now stepped before cameras to announce they had been deceived. Their statements carried a particular weight. These were not Nixon's enemies. They were the last allies he had possessed, and they were gone. 2 days later, on the evening of August the 7th, 3 of the most powerful Republicans in Washington made the short drive to the White House. Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, Senate Minority Leader Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, and House Minority Leader John Rhodes of Arizona arrived to deliver a verdict no president had ever been forced to hear. They sat with Nixon in the Oval Office and told him, with as much gentleness as the truth allowed, that the numbers were irreversible. How many votes could he count on in the Senate? Nixon asked if it came to a trial. Goldwater told him perhaps 15, perhaps fewer. 67 votes were required for conviction and removal. Nixon needed 34 senators to survive. He did not have them. He was not close to having them. The three men left the White House without offering false comfort. There was none to give. Nixon spent that night confronting the only decision remaining to him. He could submit to the full machinery of impeachment, endure a Senate trial broadcast to the nation, and face removal from office as a near mathematical certainty. Or he could resign, something no American president had ever done, and preserve whatever small measure of dignity the office still afforded him. He chose resignation. The following evening, August the 8th, 1974, Richard Nixon sat before television cameras in the Oval Office and told the American people he would leave the presidency at noon the next day. He spoke for 16 minutes. He never used the word resignation. He never admitted to obstruction. But the meaning was unmistakable. The 37th President of the United States was about to become the first to resign from office. The morning of August the 9th, 1974, arrived over Washington with the indifferent clarity of a summer day. Inside the White House, the final hours of Richard Nixon's presidency unfolded with a quality of unreality that those present would spend the rest of their lives struggling to describe. At 9:45 in the morning, Nixon walked into the East Room and faced several hundred members of his staff, cabinet officers, and their families. What followed was unlike anything in the recorded history of American public life. The President of the United States stood before the people who had served him and wept. He rambled through memories of his father, a poor man who built a small house. He spoke of his mother, calling her a saint. He quoted Theodore Roosevelt grieving over the death of his young wife. The speech had no clear architecture, no formal conclusion. It was the sound of a man undone, speaking without the guardrails of political calculation for perhaps the first time in his career. Those watching in the room, and the millions watching on television, witnessed something genuinely unprecedented. Grief, pride, bitterness, and exhaustion moving across a single face in real time. Then it was over. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Nixon and his family walked out of the White House through the diplomatic reception room and across the South Lawn. Pat Nixon walked beside him, her face composed with enormous effort. Their daughters and sons-in-law followed. The grass was bright in the late morning sun. A military honor guard stood at attention. Several hundred staff members had gathered to watch in silence. At the steps of Marine One, the presidential helicopter, Nixon turned and faced the crowd one final time. He raised both arms and flashed the double V for victory sign, a gesture so familiar from his career that it had become almost a caricature. In this moment, it read as something else entirely. Defiance, perhaps, or simply the reflex of a man who had no other gesture left. The helicopter lifted from the lawn and banked over the Potomac, carrying Richard Nixon away from the office he had pursued for the better part of his adult life. At noon, as the helicopter crossed into Missouri airspace, Nixon's resignation became official. In the East Room where Nixon had wept just hours before, Gerald Ford placed his hand on a Bible and took the oath of office as the 38th President of the United States. He turned to the cameras and spoke words that would define the moment for history. "Our long national nightmare," he said, "is over." It had lasted, in its public form, just over 2 years. In its private origins, considerably longer. What it had cost the country in trust, in institutional faith, in the basic confidence that power operates within the law, would not be so easily measured. That accounting, in many ways, continues still. Gerald Ford meant every word. The nightmare, he believed, was over. What he could not have anticipated was how quickly his own first act as president would shatter that fragile sense of relief. On September the 8th, 1974, just 30 days after taking office, Ford appeared on national television and granted Richard Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon for any crimes he may have committed against the United States. The public reaction was volcanic. Approval ratings that had opened Ford's presidency near 70% collapsed almost overnight. His press secretary resigned in protest the following morning. Many Americans who had endured 2 years of scandal, testimony, and constitutional crisis felt the fundamental promise of accountability had been stolen from them in a single Sunday broadcast. Ford would carry that decision to every campaign stop in 1976, and many historians believe it cost him the presidency. Nixon's men, however, received no such mercy. John Mitchell, the former Attorney General who had once been the most powerful law enforcement officer in the country, served 19 months in federal prison. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, the two figures who had sat closest to Nixon's inner circle, each served 18 months. John Dean, whose Senate testimony had cracked the conspiracy open, received a reduced sentence of 4 months in exchange for his cooperation. In total, more than 40 people were convicted of Watergate-related crimes. The corridors of the most powerful government on earth had, it turned out, been full of men willing to break the law on behalf of the man at its center. Congress moved quickly to ensure the conditions that made Watergate possible would be harder to recreate. Federal Election Campaign Act amendments of 1974 imposed strict limits on campaign contributions and created the Federal Election Commission to enforce them. The Ethics in Government Act of 1978 required financial disclosure from senior officials and established the framework for independent counsel investigations. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, passed that same year, placed judicial oversight on domestic intelligence gathering, the kind of unchecked surveillance that Nixon had turned into a personal weapon. These were real reforms, meaningful ones. And yet something had broken that legislation alone could not repair. In 1964, surveys found that roughly 77% of Americans said they trusted the federal government to do what was right most or all of the time. It was a remarkable number, a reflection of post-war confidence in institutions that had defeated fascism and built the interstate highway system. By the mid-1970s, that figure had fallen below 30%. It has never fully recovered. Today, it hovers in the single digits in some polls. Watergate did not cause every fracture in the American relationship with government, but it accelerated a collapse of faith that continues to shape elections, policy debates, and the basic texture of civic life. What does a democracy lose when its citizens stop believing in it? That question, first pressed urgently upon the American public in the summer of 1974, has never stopped being asked. The lessons Watergate left behind are not complicated. Power without accountability becomes corruption. Loyalty without conscience becomes complicity. And the norms that hold democratic systems together are not self-enforcing. They depend, in the end, on people being willing to defend them even at personal cost. Some did. Others did not. The country learned to tell the difference. The full story of Watergate is, in the deepest sense, a story about what democratic institutions can survive and what they require of the people inside them to survive at all. Watergate's shadow still falls across American politics today, a permanent reminder that no office, however powerful, stands above the truth. Subscribe for more histories that change the world.